was Hooker's strategy?
The Union Army was coming off a very bad year. The Battle of Fredericksburg again had been a disaster. So bad, in fact, that the commander at that battle had been taken out of command and replaced by a man named Joe Hooker, known to the press as Fighting Joe. He was going to take this massive army of his, break it into 3 parts. The plan started out very well with one exception, that is Stoneman's cavalry. Stoneman's cavalry was supposed to get roughly a week to 2 week head start on the rest of the army, but because there was heavy rains and the waters rose, Stoneman's troops couldn't get across the river. But other than that, things worked almost to perfection for Hooker. He got his the western wing of his army across the river without opposition, got it down to Chancellorsville, and so by the last day of April of 1863, Hooker had both parts of his army on either side of Lee, and all he had to do now was to follow through with his plan, bring those two together, and grind Lee in the middle. And that's when the problems began to occur.
So what was Lee's response?
Lee did, as he often did, the unexpected. Any other commander in either army, seeing himself outnumbered 2-1, boxed in on both sides, would have immediately retreated to save his army. But Lee didn't do that. Instead, Lee is going to take the more audacious strategy of splitting his army as well, leaving a small force to watch Sedgwick and hold him back at Fredericksburg. Lee's going to move with the larger portion of his force to the west and confront Hooker at Chancellorsville.
Why did Hooker's plan fall apart?
Hooker expected Lee to retreat, and on May the 1st began moving his army to the east towards Sedgwick in the expectation that there would be either no fight or a very small fight. Instead, much to his astonishment, Lee was coming out to attack him. And that's where Hooker's plan fell apart, because if Hooker just followed through with his plan confidently, he undoubtedly could have whipped Robert E. Lee and driven him back toward Richmond. But instead, Hooker at this point lost confidence in himself. Lee liked to have the initiative. He didn't like to react, he liked to be proactive. The question was, how are you going to get at Hooker's army? Hooker's got a huge force in front of you. He's now dug in. He's in heavy woods. How can you get at him? Or can you get at him? Well, Lee's going to sit down with his subordinate, Stonewall Jackson, on the night of May 1st. They're going to discuss this. They're going to send out scouts to find out what the countryside is like. And they're going to find out that Hooker's right flank is, as Jeb Stuart would later put it, up in the air. And so Lee and Jackson recognized the opportunity there. They realized that if they can get a force around to that flank and attack through those woods, they can turn Hooker's flank and possibly drive him back across the river and maybe even destroy his army.
How long did the march take before Jackson was on the flank?
Jackson's going to leave fairly early in the morning, around 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. Jackson's troops are going to get off, and they're going to be lining up for the attack roughly 2:30 in the afternoon. But the attack itself is not going to get underway until roughly 5:15.
So that's just how long it took to bring up the rest of the troops that they had a full battle line?
Exactly. Jackson's got to march about 12 miles over very narrow wagon roads hemmed in by woods. He's got 30,000 men with wagons, artillery, and so forth. It's going to take a long time for Jackson to get those troops all the way around and over to Hooker's flank and get them lined up for the attack.
Who was the general that was over on that side of the on Hooker's right flank?
The man who is on the right flank, the ground we're actually standing on right now, was General Oliver Otis Howard, called O.O. Howard by his initials. I call him O.O. Howard because a lot of times things go wrong in Howard's career. But anyhow, General Howard is in command of the 11th Corps. The 11th Corps has, here at Chancellorsville, roughly maybe 11,000 men. It's the first time this corps is going to fight with the Army of the Potomac. And in addition to being a new unit, they're also kind of an unusual unit in the Army because they're a unit that's made up largely of immigrants, and specifically German-American immigrants. They had fought earlier under the command of Franz Sigel, and in fact they were very proud of that. The Germans used to say, "I fight mit Sigel," and they said it very proudly. But just before the campaign opened, Sigel resigned in a huff over matters of seniority, and in his place is put this non-German commander, General Oliver Otis Howard, who had nothing in common with the troops he was going to command.
But they don't detect Jackson until he's already lined up his battle line?
Exactly. They detected Jackson as he was moving across, but as the day progressed, General Howard's commanders, General Hooker, all came to the conclusion that Jackson was instead retreating toward Gordonsville. So all thoughts of defending themselves kind of went out the window at that point.
Jackson hits and the corps starts to roll back. What happens then?
Jackson struck the 11th Corps directly on its flank. Instead of striking line to line, instead they came directly across at a 90-degree angle. And
to men that were pretty unprepared.
To men, many of whom had never been in battle before, who were now in heavy woods, couldn't see what was going on, could only see a few yards around them. Try to imagine if you were a Union soldier in thick, heavy woods, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, all of a sudden you're being attacked by Stonewall Jackson, 30,000 men screaming the rebel yell, knowing that each one of those soldiers has one goal for that day, and that is to take your life. It terrified the men in Howard's Corps.
So how successful is the attack?
The attack is wildly successful. In the course of a couple hours' time, General Howard's entire corps is pretty much going to be swept from the field, driven back. What that does is it's now going to put Stonewall Jackson not only on the flank of the Union Army, but now actually on the flank and rear of the Union Army. So as the night progresses, Jackson believes if he can simply move forward, slide to his left, off in this direction, he can get behind Hooker, cut Hooker off from the fords, and then Jackson will be in Hooker's rear, Lee will be on Jackson's front.
And he'll do what?
And he'll do to Hooker what Hooker had planned to do with him.
Jackson gets wounded here. How does that come about?
This is where the Confederate attack actually began. The Union right flank was somewhere in the vicinity of where we're now standing. They were driven back for a distance of about 2 miles. So roughly 2 miles, just a little less in this direction, is where Jackson would meet his fate. Jackson realized that if he stopped the attack, which had started very late in the day, if he'd stopped the attack at dark, Hooker would have a full 10 hours to regroup his army, to dig in on a different position, and by the next morning, Jackson would have to basically attack an enemy who now was expecting him. And so Jackson wanted to keep the enemy running, wanted to keep them off balance. And to do that, he had to do something that was almost never done during the Civil War, and that is a night attack. And the reason night attacks weren't done during the Civil War is because they were almost never successful. And that's exactly what happened here. Jackson is going to try to push his movement during the night, get behind Hooker, get to that ford. But as Jackson is doing a reconnaissance just before that attack is to begin, and it comes riding back toward his own troops, he and the party of horsemen who are with him are going to be mistaken for Union cavalry, and their own men are going to fire a point-blank volley into them at a distance of just a few yards. Jackson's going to be hit in 3 places, once in the right palm, twice in the left arm. One bullet is going to smash the bone just below his left shoulder, sever the artery there, and Jackson is going to be out of combat, and ultimately, just a few days later, that wound is going to take his life.